Hey everyone, so today I wanted to talk about a particular sword which I think has the fascinating and catching name of Museum of Ireland WK25. It got this name simply because it doesn't have an actual name, it's just its museum call number, but you also might call it the sword from, and I have my book down here since I don't remember all this off the top of my head, Askeaton, County Limerick. And the reason why I think this is a particularly fascinating sword when we're talking about early medieval Ireland is it has the potential to somewhat disrupt our traditional understanding of sword typology and from there other aspects of military history within early medieval Ireland. So traditionally this is viewed as a type of Petersen type A sword, which for those of you who don't know, which included me before I started researching this particular object, is a type of early Viking period sword. It's one of the sort of transitional swords seen as being from the migration age to the Viking period, quite common in Norway, and I think that's something that is worth mentioning with its categorization as Petersen type A sword, which is that when Petersen was creating his typology, it was a typology of Viking swords in Norway. And we sort of view, in many ways, the sword WK25 as a Petersen type A because it is more like a Viking sword than the native Irish swords that preceded it. It's a lot longer, it's about 90 centimeters overall length with I think around 75 centimeters blade length, which would mean our earliest, or our sort of our longest pre-Viking sword from Ireland that we know of, total length is about as long as just the blade on this object. It also has a few other features that would align it more closely with Viking swords than what we usually think of as native Irish swords before the Viking Age, such as a wide, shallow groove that to be the fuller of the blade. But something that I think is interesting in some of the articles I've read about this sword, as I sort of dug through because I thought it was a bit interesting at first, is that while it's categorized as a Petersen type A sword, it's actually somewhat different and sort of weird as a Petersen type A sword. It doesn't actually fit very neatly within this chronology of a Petersen, or a typology of a Petersen type A. I mean, it's closer to a Petersen type A sword than it is other Petersen swords. So if you're using the Petersen typology, you would call it a type A sword. But it is a bit bizarre and kind of unique with within Petersen type A's, the guards are slightly different. And I think this is noteworthy because if you don't use a Petersen typology and you use other typologies, this is where you really get the interesting results that I think sort of make this sword even more unique than it is. So if we don't use Petersen's Viking typology, and we can use the Burmer typology, which is focusing on a different period, whereas Petersen made his typology to categorize Viking period swords, particularly from Norway. Burmer was looking at continental swords of the pre-Viking migration era, and using Burmer's typology would be a Burmer type 8 sword. Which isn't analogous to the Petersen type A. Burmer's typology, because again we might think of Petersen type A as a transitional sword from the early Viking Age, where it's sort of the middle ground between what we might think of as a migration period sword and a Viking period sword. Burmer also has that at the end of his chronology. But it's not the type 8, it's a different type of sword. Burmer's, if we're categorizing it by Burmer's, it seems to be distinct from what we might consider his equivalent to the Petersen type A. Is earlier than the Viking. Its estimated date ranges between AD 650 to 850, I believe. Might be 750, I'll put the correct number down here. Which is fascinating because this would mean this sword predates the Viking Age in Ireland, and with some information I've sort of been sifting through on Burmer's typology, the Type 8 is primarily a Carolingian and Etonian sword. It's found mostly in Germany with bits in France, and gets rarer as you leave sort of the Frankish Burma Type 8 sword. And it definitely fits the categorization of this Burma Type 8 more than it does a Petersen Type A. That would mean this sword entered Ireland most likely prior to the Viking Age. Of course, we can't discount the possibility of an old sword, so we can't say definitively this is proof of a Carolingian traditional spatha sort of entering before the spatha-type swords of the Viking Age. It seems to be good evidence of sort of, we might call longsword types, this obviously just being a longsword like a spatha, not like the medieval two-handed longswords. Longsword types entering Ireland prior to the Viking Age. And while on one hand we might say this is just one sword, it's not a huge amount of proof for, you know, as much as, say, you know, the Viking swords, which do definitely seem to influence Vikings or Irish sword typologies. You know, they develop swords closer to the Viking type after the Viking Age, rather than the smaller, short swords of the pre-Viking Age. But it does still open the possibility of influence into other sword types. So if we look at your standard pre-Viking Irish sword typologies, what's usually regarded as the swords that would be used at around the time of the Viking invasion is what's called a crannog sword, of which I'll put a picture up, which are these expanded end type swords that are thicker towards the base and becomes thinner and wider at the top. And these are usually viewed as the sort of swords the Irish might be using during the Viking Age before their adoption of Viking-type swords. The problem is that really is an assumption. All the swords that have of that type, of the crannog type, that have been found in a datable context in Ireland predate the Viking Age by quite some time. I don't know if there's been one that we could definitively date after AD 700. So the reason why it's assumed they were using the crannog type swords is just because, you know, it's the latest sword we have before the adoption of Viking type weaponry. Another type of sword, which I don't know if it has its own name, but also put a few pictures of an example. This is one from a paper by Etienne, Rynne, who really is one of the experts on an Irish sword, and it's shorter than the example I showed earlier of WK25, but it has a lot of those characteristics of that I mentioned of a spatha type of the continent or of the Viking Age, where it's longer than most other Irish swords that we can definitively date to pre-Iron Age, or pre-Viking Age, I should say. That they tend to be around 75 centimeters total length. So again, this style of sword is the size typical of the largest swords that we have outside of this type of pre-Viking Ireland. They're usually regarded as being a post-Viking sword, in that it's an Irish imitation of Viking swords, sort of mixing the longer Viking spatha-type swords with the shorter pre-Viking native Irish short sword styles. Because things like this wide, shallow groove to act as the fuller, and the rectangular, thin cross-section of the tang of the blade seem much more closely aligned with Viking period swords and Scandinavian swords that were introduced during the Viking Age than the preceding Irish early medieval swords. However, if we take a sword like WK25 and we say this could show evidence of the adoption of continental European longsword types before the Viking Age, this solves two problems. One is it gives us a new context for this other sword type that we don't really have dated well. They're dated to post-Viking because they resemble Viking swords more than they do preceding Irish swords, whereas now we might be able to get these more accurately, being problem one, that they could be an imitation of continental style spatha, which interestingly enough does happen earlier in the early medieval period as well. Also, about contemporaneous with the The Cranog-style swords, although less common, is a grooved sword, which seems to imitate the Fuller and be, again, a small native short sword copy, likely influenced by continental spatha types. Although short-lived and not the same types as this, it has a deeper deeper but less wide fuller. It has a round cross-section. It doesn't seem to be an imitation of these same swords. So the other swords I showed earlier, the unnamed type of short Irish spatha types, could be copying not Viking swords, but earlier pre-Viking continental spatha types. So it would help us sort of get a better date range on these other types of swords that haven't been dated as accurately, as well as give us now a new sword type to fit into the Irish chronology of early medieval swords, by having something that could fit quite nicely in that gap of where we don't have evidence of the Cranog swords, but before the introduction of Viking swords, would fit quite nicely with when sword WK25 seems to be from. So if we imagine these being Irish copies of Frankish-style sword blades that are popping up in Ireland at the time, we have this new sword type that could fit well in this chronology. Although again, this is very tentatively placing it in that space between the Cranog swords and the Viking swords. We have one example that is still generally believed to be a Viking period sword. This is nothing certain, but it is a hypothesis that I think is quite interesting. And I also see no reason why this shouldn't be the case. After all, if we look at certain historical texts about the Viking invasion, we do highlight the differences between the way Irish warriors and Scandinavian warriors fight. And they mention particularly that the Irish warriors didn't wear armor. They had their linen tunics, whereas Viking warriors would have helmets and coats of mail. But they don't mention things like they have big swords and we have tiny swords. So if we're adopting, or if the Irish are adopting these still smaller than Viking swords, but not quite as diminutive as the early medieval Irish swords, that would help close that gap and could explain why it's not mentioned. But also during the early medieval period, there's good evidence for a lot of contact between Ireland and the Frankish world, particularly on an academic level. Irish clerics and Irish scholars were present at, say, the courts of King Charlemagne and during the Carolingian and Antonian Renaissances. So there's a lot of high-level communication between the two. Likewise, we have things like Anglo-Saxon royals who are Anglo-Saxon members of the royal family who have fled after losing a civil war and losing the throne or something to Ireland. So we have a lot of high-level contact between Ireland and these spatha-using cultures. We do see this in other aspects of Irish culture. Again, that sort of cross-cultural exchange between the religious and the academic worlds. It so far really hasn't been as strongly shown in something militaristically. So I think the adoption and the introduction of continental sword types would fit that quite well. And there's no reason why we shouldn't expect, given all of this high-status exchange between Ireland and the Carolingian world, that it would fit in quite nicely that Carolingian weaponry also began to be adapted into early medieval Ireland. So again, this is a lot of hypotheticals, a lot of wondering what's up with gaps in the archaeological record. So I wouldn't put this as, this is definitely, redating that unnamed Irish sword type, or definitely saying we need to take into account an Irish adoption of continental military tactics or continental weaponry prior to the Viking Age. But I do think it's quite fascinating, and it's a good theory, and something that we might want to investigate further as academics and as reenactors of what if we do have the influence of continental spatha types in Ireland prior to the Viking Age. And it's something I think has a lot of potential for discussion, and I look forward to reading everyone's comments on the matter.